Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
When I was a child, fairies existed. I didn't just believe in them, they were there, a reality that I never thought to question. I suppose other children of my temperament would have had imaginary friends, but my mother had spoiled me all my short life with tales of magic and wonder and fairy dust, and so I had my fairies. I didn't call them that at the time, but looking back, the term is the best way to describe the small folk who played among the forest of crystal green bottles my grandmother collected and displayed on a large vanity in her room. I don't know how many times I sat alone in that room, or how long each vigil lasted. It may have been often, or only a handful of times, but my most distinct memory is of watching them dance through the afternoon sunlight that shone through a window in that room and reflected in the crystal and glass bottles, a maze of light. No other memory I possess can compare to the clear and simple joy of that golden afternoon. They never spoke, not that I recall. At the very least, I never understood them. Neither were they interactive. They played together, and I watched them. You would have thought they didn't notice me if it hadn't been for the occasional wave or giggle. They seemed to be delighted by my observance of them, but indirectly so. As I said earlier, I didn't see anything odd or off about these tiny creatures. I was a child with a vivid and vast imagination, with little context for what reality consisted of. It didn't seem off that my fairies didn't seem to come from anywhere or go anywhere when they were finished frolicking. They were simply there, suddenly, as if they always had been. When they left, it was as if they'd slowly faded away, but you would be hard-pressed to state exactly when.
More, please. Haven't seen a fae thread in a while. There's nothing quite as eerie and soothing as some of these stories. There's a strange spot in my backyard, live out in the middle of nowhere, where I've always gotten this odd sensation. For years now, it's somewhat haunted me. I'd go out there as a child and just stand, waiting, but for what I couldn't tell you. Sometimes I wonder if there were any truth to fairies or nature entities, elementals of the sort. Would they be in a spot like that? Would the entrance to their world be in an area like that? Who knows? Forever the interesting subject, though.
One other oddity is the lengths of time which these memories seem to cover. I must have sat still and quietly watched those little fairies for hours. I was a different sort of child, I'll admit. A lonely kid who didn't mind loneliness. I had a large, loving family and still managed to keep entirely to myself. All the same, I was a child, and even quiet children can easily become fidgety. So it seems odd that there were no feelings of restlessness or impatience, just a hazy happiness and a complete willingness to simply watch. In fact, there is a very dreamlike haze to those memories, and at times I'm tempted to simply write them off as such. Beautiful and precious dreams perhaps, but still only dreams. This doesn't fit the context of these memories though. One in particular in which my mother came to fetch me because the family were going for a walk, segues completely into a mundane and average memory, which seems to give it a bit more legitimacy. My family only lived in my grandparents' home for a couple of years, and I continued to watch the fairies throughout that time period. They were always in that same room and only ever among the harlequin paradise created in the midst of those sunlit bottles. Those memories were powerful though, and young as I was, they remain relatively clear. I remember very little else from that period of my life. Those memories are bittersweet, though I know I'd be frightened if I were to experience them now I'm older and maybe wiser. Still, whenever I come across an old bottle, I get a little tingle and can't help but think of them as slightly magical. And that's my story. I apologize for dragging out the posting. I was hoping for some more replies. Anybody else have any fae stories, maybe some related copy pasta?
I don't have many stories or anything, and I don't want to discredit your story here, but I think you're referring to Landvaettir, or land spirits. Fairies are monstrous things. Think troll. It's just that the common understanding of them has changed to fairies or sprites. Maybe what you had could be sprites, but they were not fairies. Well, mine is more a dark fae story. You see, I was born in Alaska, and had lived there for the first 11 years of my life until my mother came down with an incredibly rare cancer. I'm not going to say what type, It's rare enough that the name alone would be enough to figure out who I am. Anyway, the only doctor in the country who was available at the time for studying my mom's case was in Manhattan, so we drove across Canada in a 19-day trip to Ithaca, New York. The place we moved to was this condo-ish place with a practically cardboard wall, but it was better than nothing. To understand the full impact of all of this, you would have to know that my mother's family has an odd predisposition to paranormal events occurring in the vicinity, at least odd enough for others to notice. Family curse, genetics, who the fuck knows, but it can get annoying at times. The main thing that came with this predisposition was some clairvoyance, not talking to the dead or seeing dead people, but just knowing where somebody had died, knowing if there was bad juju in the area without external knowledge, stuff like that. So in essence, we got spooked easily when something seemed off. So back to where we were in Ithaca. We lived near the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Sanctuary Drive to be exact. Go ahead, look it up on Google Maps. There was this section of woods past the small circle around in the road that just either felt incredibly welcoming on some days, or felt like you were being watched by hateful eyes on others. Like the feeling when somebody is staring a hole into the back of your head. Set that feeling a few standard deviations above the description, and you have what those woods were like. The strange thing was, it wasn't like the entire bird sanctuary felt so hateful. It was just that small patch. Another note, there was a sharp dichotomy in the woods at the path that leads through. You can see it if you look closer in on the map. The left side, if you were walking into the woods, was incredibly decayed with more than a few fallen trees and abandoned turkey nests. It reeked of rotting vegetation. The right-hand side on walking in actually seemed maintained, like somebody came in and lifted the trees. For those of you who don't know what lifting is, it's basically where the lower branches are cut off to propagate upward growth. There were also these mounds of dirt everywhere that were each 3 to 4 feet tall, but I'm not sure of the significance there. We normally felt spooked on walking into the woods, and the occasional odd occurrence happened. Like this one time, it suddenly smelled as if there was a week-old dead body in those woods the moment we entered. But the next day it was totally gone, and was totally normal. This other time we smelled what was like jasmine in the middle of a cold snap in January, but that only lasted for minutes, and only as we were walking into that patch of forest. A couple of times we even found dog leashes hung up like they had been used to hang something 4 or 5 feet off the ground. Then, nearing the end of winter, where there was still a good amount of snow on the ground, February, the dog was refusing to do his last pee for the night outside on the front lawn. My mother assumed it was because I was being impatient with him, but he was legit tail between the legs freaked out, and so I was creeped out in turn. So, my mother decided to take the dog out, but didn't want to go out alone since we were too close to those woods for comfort. What was she thinking? Her kid can go out on his own, but she's too freaked out to do the same. Anyway, we walked further out to the main road that Sanctuary Drive split off of, and the dog just started staring down the road, where the loop was. My mom and I looked over, and there was this tall, bipedal, skinny creature that was just watching us. Then, it calmly turned around and walked into the woods. My mother thought she was just seeing things, but when we confirmed that what we saw actually just happened, we busted ass inside. From then on, the movements made by the stump only became more dramatic, and 2 days before we finally moved out, it was only 8 or 10 feet from the path. We were thoroughly creeped out, but decided to take a cell phone photo because it was so close. Before you ask, it was dropped in water, etc. In short, we lost the image. The next day, the stump was split straight down the middle, to the roots. The thing that gave me chills is that one of the branches was now in the shape of a hand, in a waving position, I guess. Not much else has happened since we moved, although this house has its own quirks per se. Of course, the stuff I explained wasn't all that happened. Sometimes we would see a faint green glow from deeper in the woods at night, or hear mock yelling for dogs' names. Think of the example given with the Goatman story. So the area was just creepy in general. Anyway, if any /x/ files out there live in that area, feel free to check it out. I just wouldn't recommend staying there overnight. Some of it is considered protected habitat, and there's this group of assholes that thinks it's fun to hunt the local deer while drunk back there.
Been a long-time lurker, and had no real desire to post anything until now. I'll start with some backstory first. Grew up in Oakville, Ontario, Canada, moved to North Carolina in 2006. Moved to Daytona Beach this fall for school. When I was younger, I was afraid of the dark and things that went bump in the night just as most kids were. I thought I would catch glimpses of things just out of sight, and as I tried to fixate on them, they would vanish. I thought I would hear strange noises, but these could also be dismissed as nothing clearly audible could be discovered. Around the time that I was 8 or 9, I started to wake up to pressure on my legs, as if someone was sitting on the end of my bed. I would quietly nope myself back to sleep as I pulled the covers over my head. This was off and on for a few weeks until I'd come to the conclusion that it was just a figment of my imagination, so I spoke with my dad. I told my dad about what had been going on for the past few weeks, and thought that he may just dismiss the experiences as just childish fears. It was quite the opposite. He began to ask me questions applying to these encounters, and filling in blanks to things I had not even thought of yet. Most importantly, he asked me if I had seen him. I didn't know if what was going on was real, let alone whether the presence was a male person. I told my dad that I hadn't seen anything, and he seemed surprised but then began to dismiss it all as probable nightmares. Several days passed without incident until this time, I awoke to the pressure close to my chest at the side of my bed. I still did not see anything, but this time, I heard a deep voice. A voice of someone that sounded like they smoked a couple packs of smokes a day. The following morning, after a night of minimal sleep, I spoke with my father about what had happened. I told him that the man he asked me about was in my room. All I could make out from the man at my bedside's voice was him asking me how'd I'd been, followed by mumbling, and then the name, Thomas. My name is Chris, but my uncle's name is Tom. I asked my dad if the man was talking about my Uncle Tom, to which I was told a story about when my father was a child. When my dad was around 4, my grandparents bought an old house on Chartwell Road, in what is known as Old Oakville, very close to the shore of Lake Ontario. The house was beautiful and rather grandeur, but there was an issue with the previous owner. The house belonged to a man who would sail on the Great Lakes to conduct trade, or ship goods, or I guess whatever he could do to make a living with his boat. This man, in his older age, apparently became depressed for whatever reasons and took his own life in the house. He cut his wrist in a bathroom upstairs, walked out of the bathroom, down the hall, down the stairs, across the foyer and into the study where he collapsed and bled to death in front of a fireplace. There were stains on the hardwood floors depicting the trail that he took and a larger stain in front of the fireplace. Now, being the super non-spiritual, non-religious people that my grandparents are, they didn't give 2 fucks and just removed the hardwood floor and put in carpet like everybody did in the 60s. Not a word, however, of what happened to the previous owner was spoken to the children for obvious reasons. The house was big, but my father's family was bigger, and space was limited. My Uncle Tom had to sleep in the attic, which was not some spooky attic. It was finished, heated, and cozy. My dad tells me that about a year had passed since they had moved into the house until my uncle started asking questions about the previous owner of the house. Bewildered by his questions, my grandparents asked what he wanted to know, to which my uncle responded, "What happened to Captain Salter?" There was no possible way that my uncle, being only 10, could have known who the previous owner was without my grandparents telling him. Stunned by his question and not really knowing how to respond, my grandmother had asked, "Who's Captain Salter?" Casually, my Uncle Tom said that he was a man who would come and speak to him at night. He went on to say that he was a nice man but lonely, and found comfort in speaking with my uncle. As aforementioned, my grandparents simply don't believe in the paranormal, so they shrugged off what my uncle was telling them and fabricated a story of their own that the previous owner had simply moved away. My father told me that he asked my uncle about Captain Salter, but that my Uncle Tom was very sparing with the details as Captain Salter was a private man. Let me just take this time to say I appreciate your patience. I really should have typed this out in a document and just pasted it before posting. Sorry about the delays. Apparently these encounters didn't happen every night, but they did continue for a couple more years. After the first discussion with my grandparents, he felt like he didn't need to talk to them again, as he felt like they had lied to him, and this new friend of his posed no threat. This is where things become a little confusing for me. Fast forward many years to my childhood. Just before I started feeling like someone was sitting at the foot of my bed, my brother and I, he was in the room across the hall from me, would wake up to the smell of something burning. Not the scent of a bonfire, but more like the smell of burnt toast. We never discovered that we were both waking up to the same stimulus until several years later, when it just came up in conversation. Then after the first occasion that I heard this spirit's voice and was too paralyzed by fear to respond, the following night, after my dad's story, I was awakened, yet again, by the same pressure and voice. This time, I replied. First off, I have a question that I'm not sure if anybody can definitively answer, but if someone can, awesome. Can spirits become lost? If they are trying to seek out someone, can they mistakenly stumble across a family member who is around the same age as the person that they were originally talking with? I'm sure that the fact I'm related by blood to my uncle, that may play a factor in it. Anyhow, I replied to this entity that was at my bedside. I exclaimed that my name was not Thomas, but that my name was Chris, and Tom was my uncle. There was silence at first, followed by the presence and pressure on my bed slowly fading away. 2 or 3 weeks passed, I can't really remember, without an occurrence. It was New Year's Eve, and my parents were out getting hammered. My older brother was at home watching us. I had a ceiling fan with a light above my bed. I got ready for bed, pulled the link to turn the light on my fan off, and laid down to fall asleep. Within perhaps 15 seconds of my eyes being closed, I felt the sensation that I was being shaken. I felt this before, opened my eyes and it was gone, but this was different. I opened my eyes, but it continued. I sat up, stood on top of my bed and turned my light on, but the shaking persisted. I ran out of my room, into my brother's room where I remained until the following morning. I was pretty shaken up the next day, but my parents just kept reassuring me that they thought that they were shaking at times in the night and that they were okay. I was young and, of course, super trusting of my parents, so I decided that I was fine. Nothing happened the following night, nor any night for a few years until we moved to another town, away from Oakville. Life carried on as usual, but one day as I was walking to school, I saw a few of my friends about to leave their house, so I decided to wait around the corner of their house to jump out and scare them. LOL, I thought I was such a cool teenager. On the contrary, it was to my surprise when I heard my friend's sister scream. I turned the corner to see them comforting her as she cried. She said that she was touting bread, but the toaster wasn't plugged in. She put the bread in the toaster, went to the pantry to get some peanut butter or whatever, and when she turned around, the bread was pushed into the toaster and toasting without being plugged in. I really didn't know what to make of the situation, so I carried on as usual with my day, all the while thinking about what happened earlier. It had been a few years since I had smelled something burning in my house, but after that day, the following night brought those reminiscent odors with it. Nothing else ever came of it, so I think. My Uncle Tom became pretty ill. He was a heavy drinker for quite some time and developed cirrhosis, scarring of the liver, and was in need of a transplant. Unfortunately, that help never arrived and my uncle passed away. We moved a couple months after the fact, which brought us to 2006, when I moved to the States. About a month, maybe just shy of a month, after I moved to North Carolina, I got a call from my friend who lived down the street from me in Canada. Turns out his sister had died. I couldn't go back up there for the funeral or anything, so that was pretty shitty. Just as a recap, she was the one who was crying about the toaster occurrence. She died of an overdose. My friend told me she had been battling depression for a long time, and I guess she had just succumbed to it. At least, that was my original thought towards the matter. Several more years passed during my time in North Carolina without any encounters whatsoever, which brings us to now. My grandparents lived at 184 Chartwell Road, a fact that I hadn't learned until today. I now currently reside in apartment 184 in my apartment complex. I keep it pretty cold in my place, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But when I awoke in the middle of the night, last night, it was damn near 40. Air conditioner wasn't continuously running nor on the fritz. I didn't see or hear or feel anything last night, but I do feel very uneasy in my apartment now. I was wondering if anybody knew whether or not spirits were really into following those they have previously connected with. I will also post an update in the morning, should anything happen or not.
I can't say if the girl with the toast and overdose is in any way connected, not for sure. The toast could just be a coincidence. As for the rest, spirits can and will follow whatever they choose. A spirit can bond to just about anything, whether it be something mundane, like a ring, average, like a house, or complex, like a bloodline. From what I've read, it seems that this spirit may have bonded with your bloodline after your uncle was so kind and non-judgmental. I, personally, have had the spirit of an old man following me around since I was about 7. He has done many things to help me in life, such as ward off malevolent spirits, whisper in other people's ears. When a spirit does this, the words seem to the listener like their own thoughts, and warn me of people I should avoid. Spirits see auras and energy signatures. Imagine it like everything that lives or once lived looking like color-coded clouds. I would suggest doing what your uncle did. Befriend this spirit. He most likely is watching over you by your uncle's request. Or when you were younger, your aura looked exactly the same as your uncle's did when he was a child. Either way, you have nothing to worry about. Try not to fixate on the toast thing.
Own a large property in the country that has been in the family for generations. Great-grandfather bought it from the Native Americans when they started selling off land, Oklahoma. Lots of weird things happen in our area, as well as specifically out there on our property. Belong to a tribe of Germanic pagans, decide that we are going to build a temple in one of the forest clearings on the property. Build a horgur, stone altar, in a different clearing for making offerings to the Landvaettir, land spirits. One little problem, there is a big fruit tree growing in the center of the clearing and there is no way to build around it. Down comes the fruit tree. A few days have passed. Parents, who have a cabin at the front of the property, begin hearing loud screaming noises that they have never heard before. Father grew up deep in the Ozarks and was in the Special Forces, but he has never heard anything remotely like this. Weird. Trees around the property begin getting destroyed in bizarre ways. Huge cedar tree limbs appear to have been twisted until they popped. There are branches as big as my arm that have simply been torn off and tossed around. The next day, several trees are simply snapped in half about 10 to 15 feet up. The day after that, 2 trees are pushed over, roots and all, across the road we use to move around the property. There are no storms or bad weather at this time. The ground around the trees is totally undisturbed. There are other trees that are within feet from the destroyed trees that are totally unharmed, and there is no sign of claw marks or damage to the trees, other than being ripped apart and thrown around. The screams can still be heard from time to time during all of this, though. I'm pretty sure that we've pissed off a troll by cutting that tree down. Shit. Take the tribe out to the stone altar and make offerings to the troll in the hopes of making peace. Bags of fresh apples, fresh bread and butter, ale, jars of stone beads, some handcrafted jewelry that included a bracelet. Leave. Check on offerings a few days later. The beads have been removed from the jars which were left by the altar, and now rest on the stump of the tree that we cut down, along with the bracelet. Good sign or a bad sign? I'm going to go with good. Better have a feast to celebrate. No more ruined trees, no more bizarre screams. We make offerings to her every month now of all her favorite things in order to maintain the peace and goodwill between us. Build a stone altar specifically for her and her offerings. Many people become frightened when going down that trail, and most animals freak out and refuse to go down that way. A person who says she can see things like this joins us for a feast one night. Says that she sees it. Apparently she's pretty frightening to look at. We call her Wendy now. Although she isn't particularly hostile any longer, she still does odd things to remind us that she is there. We put some tobacco on the same platter as her apples once, and within an hour the apples had been moved onto the stone altar and the tobacco was scattered. Apparently she doesn't like them touching, so we make sure to use separate platters now. We had a 50-pound block of salt near the grove just up and vanish one day, and despite lots of searching, it never turned back up. Lots of things like that. The only one that I would call disturbing was when the neighbors at a nearby property had a dog that would run around the property at times and bark at us and our horses while we were out there. One day we went out there to leave Wendy her apples and ales, and there was the dog beneath a nearby cedar tree. It was torn all to pieces, but there was still enough of it left for us to know what it was. We have come to the conclusion that she is no great fan of dogs.
That's pretty cool, man. Thanks for sharing. Did she like the tobacco?
Yes, so long as it is kept separate from the other things like her apples, bread, or cheese, she seems to like it. She just doesn't like it mixed in with anything else. Someone suggested that since it isn't edible, she likely wants it kept apart from the mostly edible offerings we make.
Belong to a tribe of Germanic pagans. Build a horger, stone altar, in a different clearing for making offerings to the Landvaettir, land spirits. One little problem. There is a big fruit tree growing in the center of the clearing, and there is no way to build around it. Down comes the fruit tree. So you worship land spirits, and then tear down a fruit tree. Pretty much the most literal symbol of the earth's bounty. Wow, you are really stupid. It's like going to worship a fire spirit and piss all over a bonfire.
Well, for one, it's not like it was the only one in the area or something. There are dozens of the same sort on the property, even a whole grove. I've had to cut several down before for various reasons in the past, and nothing odd ever came of it. And just because you believe in and honor land spirits doesn't suddenly mean every tree, fruiting or not, is suddenly sacred and untouchable. There has to be something, generally, that sets them apart as sacred.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.